So I'm the Affirmative, and my name is Isabel Lai, I-S-A-B-E-L, space, L-A-I.
I'm the negative, John, J-O-H-N, Maglore, M-A-G-L-O-I-R-E.
John, are you ready? Okay. My judges? All right. I stand in affirmation to the resolution which states resolved, social media strengthens American democracy. Democracy. It's one of the most recognizable and core features of our country. And it's much more than just a system of government that has free and fair elections. As Stanford University explains, a democracy has to have participation from its people in civic life. If you have a completely free and fair election and nobody comes out to vote in it, then it doesn't matter at all. And this by the people, for the people mentality is what makes democracy so valuable. It means that every time that we as citizens vote, every time we hold our politicians accountable for their actions. And every time we have meaningful political discussions across the country, we are strengthening the institutions of our democracy. And social media, which has taken the world by storm, has been a powerful tool in getting people active. A study by the University of California, San Diego estimated that Facebook activity and posts from friends increased voter turnout by over 300,000 voters in 2010. And especially among young people, social media has played a crucial role in getting people civically active. A perfect example of this happened last year in my hometown of Springfield, Missouri, when some students from my school and a school in the neighboring town of Nixa got together using Twitter to organize a peaceful protest that worked together with senatorial candidates and, despite being a Black Lives Matter protest, worked together with the local police. So not only does social media make people more politically active and more likely to vote, it completely levels the playing field, erasing barriers between those who are geographically and ideologically separated. With 323 million people, Americans have all different kinds of experiences, and social media opens a window into the minds of others that we might never reasonably encounter in real life. When you see something on television reporting about a group of people, it's easy to make accusations or generalizations. But when you're confronted with an online interaction, it puts the humanity back into politics, decreasing polarization and allowing us to rationally discuss important issues that affect Americans. The most meaningful political conversation I've ever had was actually through social media. Shortly after President Trump's inauguration, this person wrote several paragraphs explaining why they supported him. And even though it was one of the more controversial elections in our recent history, when I responded with my own views in opposition, we were able to have a civil conversation and learn things from each other, each of our unique viewpoints bringing a different perspective to the table. And to this day, something that they said has really stuck with me, even months after we finished our conversation, that our interaction reminded him that ultimately, the majority of people are good, reasonable, and trying to do what's best for everyone. The greatest threat to our democracy is the demonization of our fellow citizens. Social media has shown me and has shown millions of other Americans that we are ultimately more similar than we are different. And while we may have different political views or come from different places around the country, we are ultimately working towards the same goal of strengthening American democracy. And that's the thing about social media. It doesn't have a mind of its own. It's not evil or good. What makes it so good is the people that use it. Social media, through its unique interactive platform, has become a powerful tool that American citizens use to strengthen our democracy. It not only encourages people to vote, to get people politically active and make change within their own local communities and working with others within it, it allows people to become more informed, and most importantly, it brings humanity back into politics. Whenever people are making connections across the globe and across the country, that's when America is at its best. When we're able to see diversity and recognize that despite different political opinions, we're ultimately all Americans. So I'd like to firmly stand in affirmation because of these reasons, and I urge you to do so as well. Thank you.
Is everybody ready? Great. In 1807, Thomas Jefferson stated, "He who knows nothing is nearer to the truth than he whose mind is filled with falsehoods and errors." Because I agree with Jefferson, I negate the resolution. Social media strengthens American democracy. My first point is that social media disseminates inaccurate and unreliable information. Social media has become an increasingly popular source for news, especially among younger audiences. According to a Pew Research Center study conducted in January, 35% of respondents between ages 18 and 29 said that social media was the most helpful source of information about the presidential campaign. Additionally, recent data from YouGov profiles reveals that adults aged 18 to 34 are now more likely to say that social media networks are their primary source of news. This reliance on social media is to young voters' detriment because social media is a breeding ground for inaccurate information. A CNN tech study found that more than a third of the top 200 stories on social media about the two major US presidential candidates were from fake news sites during the 2 months before the election. Just think about it. How many times have you seen posts on Facebook that you know are factually wrong? This becomes even more frightening when coupled with the fact that Americans increasingly trust political news on social media. Everett Rogers of the Free Press reports that the information shared on online social networks such as friends and family members have a stronger persuasive influence on users. As individuals trust the information circulated through their personal networks, this lessens the need for information verification. The social media user thus has the luxury of laziness, expending very little effort to learn about politics. Thus, social media is extremely bad for democracy, as more and more Americans believe in accurate information without verifying it. This leads to misinformed voters. James Brennan of Brown University argues that misinformed choices at the ballot box have harmful consequences for society as a whole, and we're all forced to live with those consequences. Brennan notes that a misinformed voter is analogous with a drunk driver. Just as a drunk driver cannot drive well, a misinformed voter cannot vote well. Therefore, by creating more misinformed voters, social media is detrimental to American democracy. My second point is that social media inhibits exposure to diverse ideas. Exposure to a diversity of ideas is crucial to a functioning democracy. The Association of American Colleges and Universities stresses this idea writing. The ability to engage and learn from perspectives and experiences different from one's own is a crucial catalyst for intellectual and moral growth. Enhancing one's knowledge by attending seriously to differing perspectives and developing respect and empathy for others' views, even in the face of disagreement, must remain a bedrock element of a diverse democracy. Unfortunately, social media inhibits perspective taking and the challenging of ideas. While we all may have friends of different political stripes on social media, it doesn't necessarily mean that we'll read the stories that they share. This is extremely bad because according to CNN Tech, articles gain traction on Facebook thanks to the filter bubble, a phenomenon where Facebook shows you more and more of what you like, creating a confirmation bias for your worldview. ZDNet reports that Facebook's algorithm will ensure that you read shared news from viewpoints similar to your own. Your feedback loop is in essence self-curated based on what you actually like. And if you don't like your friends and what they share, you can unfollow and unfriend them, thus whittling down the echo chamber to an even smaller sample size. In essence, social media is simply a mechanism by which Americans can artificially verify their own worldviews without ever being exposed to opposing viewpoints. My third point is that social media undermines civil discourse. In today's already polarized climate, we should be doing everything we can to create a more amicable political environment. However, social media is actually contributing to a more polarized democracy. In fact, according to the Pew Research Center, roughly half of social media users feel the political conversations they see on social media are angrier, less respectful, and less civil than those in other areas of life. This has led to less political participation, as Richard Davis of Oxford found that online interaction has been shown to contain elements of flaming, vitriolic language that discourage participation among a wide audience and harm the potential for a deliberative democracy. To conclude, because social media leads to a coarsening of discourse and a dissemination of fake news, I strongly believe social media is detrimental to American democracy.
I'm going to take some preparation time, if that's all right. Is this working? All right. John, you ready? My judges? All right. So I'd like to really use this time to talk about some of the things my opponent said. And mainly, what we have to look at is that while my opponent brought up a lot of theoreticals, saying that this polarization would happen, what we're looking at is that he hasn't brought up any real-life Americans, any actual people, or their stories, or how they have been affected by this in today's debate. And that's something that's the most important thing that we have to look at, because humanity is what our country is based on. When we're looking at the facts, when we're looking at real-life examples of, for instance, my friend in Springfield, Missouri, staging a Black Lives Matter peaceful protest with a friend from Nixa through social media, to have a peaceful dialogue with the local police department. That's causing change, that's for the better. When we're looking at real life people like myself and the person that I met on social media, having a civil conversation and being able to understand each other better and to be able to look at each other's humanity, that's change. And when we're looking at people like President Obama and President Trump, both extending their condolences to Senator John McCain through social media, we're seeing that actual humanity, when we're looking at real life and we're looking at real Americans, is being reached through social media and because of social media. So when we look at his claim that inaccurate information is being spread, what we have to see is that, first of all, that's not really something unique to social media. And I would actually argue that social media makes it less likely that you'll have polarization and that you'll have inaccurate information. Because when we're looking at the mainstream news sources, when we're looking at all of these news networks on the television, we know that they have a slant and that they have a bias to them. So anybody that's going to self-select any sort of news articles is already going to do that through the mainstream media. And the studies that he brings up, talking about how these fake news sites are happening on social media, are all from a CNN tech study, who would have a very good reason to try and discredit social media as a whole. And what we have to look at is that these things that he's talking about are not really unique to social media at all. And when we look at the benefits of social media, we're ultimately seeing a net positive because he hasn't really attacked the core of social media and what social media is, which is an interactive platform. That's something that television lacks, and that's something that all of these other platforms lack and we haven't seen before. We're able to have a giant dinner conversation, but with people around the country, and we're able to see people's views that we wouldn't have been able to see before. Somebody who lives in an urban area might not understand the struggles of someone living in a rural area until they talk to them through social media. And that's actually what we're talking about when we look at diverse ideas. We're actually seeing people being able to connect with each other across the country. Without social media, you don't have that at all. And when we look at this idea that civil discourse is being undermined, and he talks about how people are more angry and people are confronting each other, not only is this a poll of how people feel, but ultimately it's better to have people discuss things with each other, even if they're in a bit of an angry tone, than to have them not be able to see those viewpoints or even acknowledge that those viewpoints exist, like they would be living in their own community, not connecting with other Americans across the country. And that's really the core of the argument today, whether or not social media as a platform is beneficial to our democracy. And we have to see that it is, because it is a unique platform that allows us to communicate with each other and allows us to see the humanity in politics. Thank you.
Is everybody ready? First, let's begin at the top of my opponent's case. The first piece of evidence that my opponent brings up is the UCLA, University of California, San Diego evidence, which said that in 2010, Facebook led to an increase in turnout. There are 3 problems with this. First, the evidence never shows a causal link. It never shows that the reason that this voter turnout increased is specifically because of social media. There could have been other factors related to this. Second, look to recency. This study was published in 2010. I think we can all agree here that the 2016 election made us change the way we think about how elections work in the United States. So I would say any election before the 2016 election is going to work a lot differently than it works now in the status quo. So even if this phenomenon did occur in 2010, it's not necessarily going to repeat itself. But third, the Davis evidence that I read in the neg is very good on this piece of evidence. And essentially what Davis says is that because social media discourse is so negative and because people are getting so disgusted with the discourse on social media, they're actually less likely to vote. And you can see the clear warrant there, the clear logical warrant. Because people are so sick of hearing about this negative politics on social media and talking to each other in such a nasty way, they no longer want to participate in politics. But then let's go to my opponent's second point, where she talks about how students got together on Twitter to organize a Black Lives Matter protest. First, this is non-unique. You can look to the civil rights movement, one of the most successful protest movements in United States history. Was there social media? No, of course not. Activism and protests are perfectly effective without social media. And if you look at the vast majority of grassroots movements, for example, the Tea Party, that happens by going door to door, to contacting many different people. You don't need social media to spread the word about something, and the perfect example and the best example of activism is the civil rights movement, which used no social media whatsoever. Then my opponent says that online interaction puts humanity into politics. But we can clearly see this isn't true, because the Pew Research Center tells us that 50% of all Americans who use social media actually think it's more nasty than in real-life conversations. So if we are to believe that we need to put the humanity back into politics, then we should negate so that we avoid this terrible discourse on social media. Finally, my opponent says that the greatest threat to democracy is demonization of others. And once again, the Pew evidence is really good here, because it shows you that social media is a new mechanism whereby we can demonize each other. Now, my opponent's going to say that she gave you an anecdote, and I don't give any anecdotes. But if we actually compare the two, there's one anecdote and one example of social media doing something positive. And then there's a survey among hundreds of thousands of people who actually say that social media is worse for discourse and it makes demonization even more prevalent. But now let's go to the neg case. So at the top of the case, my opponent says that Obama and Trump gave condolences through social media. First of all, they could have done this without social media. They could have went on the media, and they could have contacted Senator McCain personally. So I don't see why social media is necessary for this. But then my opponent makes a really big point on my first point about inaccurate information, that that this problem is not unique to social media, but it is for two reasons. First, because of how wide an audience that social media can reach. Even if we had this problem in the past, social media makes it worse because this fake news is reaching more people. But secondly is because of the Rogers evidence. And the Rogers evidence says that because information on social media is shared by friends and family, we think that we can trust it and we don't verify that information. Then, on my second point, about the confirmation bias, this goes totally unresponded to. And this is really important, because it shows you that social media doesn't actually expose us to new ideas, it actually hurts discourse. And then finally, on the third point, my opponent ignores the Pew analysis. She said discussion is good even if it's angry, but oftentimes look in the Facebook comment sections. They're ad hominem attacks. They're not substantive. I'm ready whenever you are.
All right, judges ready? Okay. So could I have first question as first speaker?
Yes.
All right. So when you talk about this idea that social media is reaching wide audiences, that it's from friends and family, why is this unique to social media? Why not, again, through television or through word of mouth?
Sure, so there's a couple of things. First of all, social media empowers you to connect with people that you don't necessarily see on an everyday basis. And basically what the Rogers evidence says that I read is when we are relatives with people and when we trust these people, and that information is shared with us on social media, which it's done, of course, more times than in real life because we have more access to social media and talking to these people. People actually bypass the need to verify this type of information, which means that they fall into the trap of believing information just because their relatives shared it. Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
So you talk about how students got together on Twitter to organize a Black Lives Matter protest. Can you explain why the civil rights movement was successful without social media?
I know what argument you're trying to make here, and I'd like to respond to it in a couple ways. First of all, the fact that the resolution's not talking about which way is better. It's just talking about whether or not social media has made a positive change in strengthening American democracy. And the fact is that it is, and it has. It doesn't matter if it's a unique tool. But the fact is that social media has made positive change for our country and positive change for our democracy. It doesn't matter if it could have been done a different way. It was done through social media. And I think that's an important point that you really seem to miss when we're talking about today's debate.
So as a quick follow-up to that, if I can show that there are net harms to social media, and we can still have this activism without social media, would that warrant a negative ballot?
Okay, I think that you're getting a little bit off track here. What we're looking at is democracy and whether or not real, actual American people are being affected.
But that doesn't answer my question.
To do that, we have to look. Sorry, could I finish?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, to do that, we have to look at social media as a platform. And what you failed to look at is the interactivity and the unique portions of social media that allows it to connect people across the country, just like you said in your last answer.
Okay, do you have a question?
Yes, when you're talking again about how we could have done it through the civil rights movement, does that mean that you agree that we have made positive change through social media?
The civil rights movement did not use social media.
Right, but you said we could have accomplished all of these things through other methods like the civil rights movement.
Sure, I mean, you give one...
Do you then agree that we have accomplished great things through social media?
No, I agree that one protest was organized because that's the only evidence that you provide, right? You don't give any analysis which shows what major, as a whole, activist movement started because of social media.
Could I?
Yeah.
All right. So actually, the whole Black Lives Matter movement started entirely on social media. And I think that's a really good example of what we're seeing in today's society. When we're looking at police offices increasingly using body cameras because of the Black Lives Matter movement. When we're looking at protests happening around the country thanks to the Black Lives Matter movement. And we're looking at protests for Native Americans when we're looking at the Dakota Access Pipeline and other movements that have happened around the country. I think it's clear that social media has not only brought people together, but brought people together to make a substantive change to improve our democracy.
So here's, in essence, the problem with that. My opponent's argument is that social media is a means to affect change. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, this idea, the reason that the Black Lives Matter movement started, for example, is because people were tired of certain injustice. Had there not been social media, I don't think people would have said, well, there's injustice, but I don't have social media, therefore we're not going to do anything. And this is a really important point, because the fact is there are net harms to social media, to democracy. It discourages participation. It makes a much worse and much more polarized society. And at the same time, the one benefit that my opponent provides, creating these activist movements, can simply be done without social media. So at the end of the day, when we look at all the harms and all the benefits that social media offers, at best, all social media is a means of spreading these activist movements, but they can be done without social media.
All right, are there other questions?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'll be using the rest of my time to prepare.
How much do you have?
I used 48 seconds.
Okay.
I have a minute and 12. All right, it's working. Okay. So I really like to use these last moments to talk about really what today's debate is about and the core of today's debate. My opponent's main argument against all of my points about humanity, about the things and the change that social media has done to improve our democracy, has been that it's not unique to social media. But the thing is, that doesn't really matter. Today's resolution's not asking us what the best way to achieve democracy is. It's asking us whether or not social media has strengthened American democracy and whether or not it is currently strengthening it. And what we have to see is that it overwhelmingly has. He hasn't really countered the actual effects that I've brought up, talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, talking about the Dakota Access Pipeline, talking about all of these movements and connections that have been made across the country. He simply says that it's not just social media that's doing that. And the thing is that social media is a tool, but he brings that up like it's a bad thing, but it's not. And that's what's so powerful about it. Social media has made a change, and it has strengthened American democracy, and it is strengthening American democracy right now. It doesn't matter if we can achieve that through other things. And just like how a jury acquitted journalist John Peter Zenger when he informed Americans of corrupt British officers in 1733, establishing a benchmark for the freedom of the press, or when President Reagan used televised presidential debates to communicate with the American people to earn a landslide victory in 1980s. America has always supported and strengthened democracy, no matter what kinds of mediums we've had to work with. And my opponent brings that point up like it's a bad thing, that social media isn't some sort of magic wand that will fix everything. But that's actually why it's inevitable that social media has strengthened, is strengthening, and will continue to strengthen American democracy in the future. Because while technology has evolved from quills to keyboards, it's ultimately the hands that wield those tools that make all the difference. And what we have to look at is the humanity in today's debate. My opponent has yet to bring up any example of an actual American that has been affected negatively by social media. I have brought you examples from my hometown, talking about a peaceful Black Lives Matter protest that happened in conjunction with the local police department. I've brought you the conversations that I've had and many people have had around America, civilly, to discuss things across the country with diverse opinions. And I've brought you things like Black Lives Matter, who have caused change in getting police to wear body cameras and bringing accountability to the table. And that's why I don't believe in Twitter and Facebook. I believe in the American people and our ability to use those platforms to make our country and our democracy better. Thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting meaningful dialogue in our country. And no matter what side you vote for, I know you'll make a great decision.
Is everybody ready? Okay. First, I'd like to talk about this big point that my opponent brings up throughout the round, which is humanity. And that's going to be my first voting issue, humanity. Throughout my case, I show you very clear evidence that discourse and polarization are worsened because of social media. So let's do a quick thought experiment. Think about a controversial Facebook post, and then think about clicking on the comments section. I guarantee you, if you scroll through that comments section, you will see ad hominem attacks, you will see non-substantive arguments, and you will just see people yelling and screaming at each other to no end. But this is not just my opinion, this is verified by data, which is a really strong part of the negative case. Specifically, the Pew study, which surveyed people, and 50% of all social media users said that conversation and discourse on social media is worse than in any other area of society, showing that social media uniquely is bad for democracy. But additionally, there's the Davis evidence. And in my opinion, this is the most important piece of evidence in today's round, and here's why. Democracy relies on the fact that we have political participation. In fact, in the beginning of the round, my opponent even stated this. If people aren't coming out to vote, then we don't really have a democracy. And the Davis evidence says that because of this vitriolic language on social media, less people are participating in our political system, which means that social media is literally destroying the core of democracy, our political participation. So that is the most important reason that you should vote nay. But there are 3 other reasons. The second is that new ideas are not spread through social media, and in fact, social media creates an echo chamber. This was not addressed at all by my opponent in today's round. Specifically, the ZDNet evidence, which says that Facebook's algorithms make it so that you only see things that you actually like and agree with. This means that social media actually doesn't expose people to new ideas. Rather, it just reinforces your preconceived notions, which can actually make polarization worse. The third voting issue in today's round is that social media makes fake news worse. My opponent tried to make the argument that fake news is non-unique to social media. But I made a response to that my opponent never addressed, which is the Rogers evidence. And essentially what Rogers says is because social media relies on posts shared from friends and family, people are more likely to trust that information, therefore not verifying it. This is extremely important because it shows you the warrant as to why social media uniquely spreads fake news more than any other platform. And the final voting issue in today's round is that any positive impacts that come from social media can be achieved in any other way, meaning that all of the impacts that my opponent brings up about change happening, as I said during the moderator questions, well, that change could have happened without social media, and we could have avoided all the harms that I talk about. For all these reasons, I urge a negative ballot. Thank you. Nice job.